Okay, so now we know about the kinds of chords we can use, and we know how to voice those chords, and we know something about the harmonic progressions we'll use. Well, now we need to think about how we move from one chord to the next. And this is what we call voice leading. That is, once you've decided the voicing for your four voices on the one chord, and you want to go to the four chord, how do you get there? Can you do it any way you want? There are certain things you have to follow. And what we're talking about here is voice leading, and voice leading is essentially strategies for moving from one chord to the next in a harmonic progression. And I think it's very important to understand this second point here, which is these strategies are style specific. So we're talking about how someone, say, in the late 18th century would have used voice leading, how Bach would have thought about voice leading, how Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn would have thought about voice leading. Interestingly, these voice leading rules won't help you write like a late 19th or early 20th century composer like Debussy, for instance. He has different strategies and a different set of goals and ways of and principles essentially to follow to do his voice leading. If we go earlier than, say, Bach, and we go into Palestrina's time, we see also the voice leading strategies are slightly different. So voice leading strategies are style specific. So we're going to be learning the voice leading for this time period, the late 18th century. And they're going to give us insights into how composers of that time thought. Now, I'll sort of generalize now what the principles of voice leading are in that era. And then I'm going to go through and give really concrete examples of how you move from one chord to the next, how to move from the one chord to the five chord, from the four chord to the five chord, from the one chord to the six chord, like this. In general, though, we can say the following. In the upper three voices, the soprano, alto, and tenor, in general, we would keep common tones. You don't have to, but in general, you can. And that's kind of helpful because it determines certain things for us very quickly. For instance, chords that are a fourth or fifth apart always have one note in common. Chords that are a third apart or a sixth apart always have two notes in common. If we can't keep common tones, which happens with chords that are a second apart, then we want to move the voices by step. And if we can't move by step, then we want to move by the smallest possible interval. Now, in the bass, for right now, how we should think about the bass voice, we should say that it provides the root of the harmonic progression because we're only using root position chords. The bass voice will join these principles, some of these principles for the upper three voices later on when we're dealing with inversions. But for now, it really just provides the root of the harmonic progression. Another thing you generally want to try to do is incorporate contrary motion, if it's possible. Sometimes it's not, but in general it is, and you should try to incorporate it. If you're a little fuzzy on what contrary motion is, hold on for about 10 seconds, because in the next slide I'll deal with contrary motion. And you need to be very conscious of how you use the leading tone. That is, the leading tone must resolve to the tonic if it's placed in one of the outer voices, that is, the soprano or the bass. If it's in an inner voice, the alto or the tenor, you have more freedom. You can resolve to the tonic. You may be able to move it to the fifth. So these are generally, at this stage, the principles of voice leading that you should be aware of. Now, to talk about types of motion, this is more review. I will use some of these terms over the next 6 weeks, so probably useful to review them quickly. Well, parallel motion. What's a parallel motion? Well, if we have two voices and they move in the same direction, then we say it's parallel motion. If one voice stays the same and the other voice moves, doesn't matter, up or down, we call that oblique motion. Contrary motion is when we've got two voices and one moves in one direction and the other moves in the opposite direction. And of course, static is static. The voices stay exactly where they are. This we'll find actually, this kind of combination, we've got a third, when the third stays the same going to the next chord, you will find when you move from, say, the 1 chord to the 6th chord, because those 2 chords have 2 notes in common. So now what I want to do is get out of this PowerPoint environment and move into a music notation program where I can demonstrate for you some of these voice leading techniques, and you can see how this stuff is done. And then along the way, you'll also be practicing yourself to reinforce your knowledge.